She is my daughter.
Now is our Empress.
The storm came without warning. The sky over Frank Calloway's farm split open with a crack of thunder so loud that the cattle broke through the corral fence and ran for the timber. Frank came out onto the porch with a flashlight in his hand, thinking it was one of those ordinary summer storms that hit the Nebraska flats every July. Then he saw the light. It was not lightning. It was something falling out of the sky, burning a deep blue, trailing a line of fire that cut the darkness in two. The thing crossed the heavens like a burning brand torn loose from some great fire, and it went down into the cornfield beyond Willow Creek. The impact shook the ground beneath his boots. The windows of the farmhouse trembled in their frames, and somewhere down the road, a dog began to bark in a tone Frank had never heard from any animal before, pure, dumb terror. Frank stood still for a single heartbeat, his own heart slamming against his ribs. He had served in the army years ago, as a mechanic with a field unit, and some instincts never really leave a man. He set the flashlight on the porch table, climbed into his pickup, and drove down the dirt track toward the place where the thing had gone down. The corn was flattened in a perfect circle. The air smelled of burnt metal and of something else, something sweet, like wet flowers, like rain on clover. In the middle of the crater sat a dark object the size of a small car, its surface moving in a slow rhythm, as if it were breathing, as if it were made of something alive. Gray smoke leaked from a dozen cracks in its skin. Frank got out of the truck carefully. His heart was so loud he could hear it in his ears. He walked forward slowly, covering his mouth with the sleeve of his shirt against the smoke. Then he heard something that stopped him cold. Crying. It was not the cry of an animal. It was the cry of a human baby, but with a strange, almost musical tone, as if two voices were singing together at once. Frank went toward the object and found an opening in its side, a door that had simply opened itself, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of silver cloth that glowed with a soft inner light, lay an infant. She could not have been more than a few months old. Her skin was pale, but with a warm copper undertone, the color of late honey, of sand at dusk, as if the light of a different world lived just beneath her skin. Her hair was dark, almost black. And her eyes were enormous, deep amber gold, unlike anything Frank had ever seen in a human face. She stopped crying the moment she looked at him, as if she had been waiting for someone all along. Frank knew he should call the sheriff. He knew he should call somebody, the state patrol, the nearest military base, anybody. But when the child reached out her small hand toward him, something in his chest broke and rebuilt itself in the same instant. He had lost his wife 2 years before in a car accident on the county road, and since then the house had been quiet, like a room nobody dared to use. That silence ended the moment he lifted the child into his arms. Behind him, the object began to glow more brightly. Frank stepped back just as the craft, or whatever it was, folded in on itself, collapsing into a fine dust that the wind carried away in seconds. Not a bolt, not a panel, not a single piece of evidence that anything had fallen out of the sky that night. All that remained was the crater, the smell of scorched flowers, and the child sleeping peacefully in his arms. Frank stood looking at the stars for a long time, searching for answers among them. He found none. The only thing he knew for certain was that this child had survived something no human could explain, and that she now depended on him entirely. He drove home with her wrapped in his jacket. He laid her in a wooden crate lined with blankets because he had no crib, and he sat beside it all night, watching every breath she took. In the lamplight, he noticed that her skin held a faint silver shine, like moonlight lying on still water. In the morning, Frank drove into Bent Creek to buy baby formula and diapers, inventing a story about a niece he was keeping for a few days. Bent Creek was a small town. Everybody knew everybody, and Frank knew the lie would not hold up for long. His friend Boyd Tucker, who ran the garage on Main Street, was the first to notice something odd. "Where'd that baby come from, Frank?" Boyd asked, peering at the bundle asleep in the passenger seat. It's complicated, Frank said, not meeting his eyes. Boyd did not press it that day, but Frank knew that sooner or later he would have to say something, even if it was a dressed-up version of the truth. He took the child to Dr. Ruth Emery, the only physician in town, with the excuse that he had found her abandoned near the creek. Ruth examined her carefully. Vitals, temperature, weight, everything looked normal, except one detail that left her thoughtful for a long moment. Her temperature runs lower than normal, Ruth said, frowning, but it's stable, and her heartbeat is different. It's not an arrhythmia, it's just different. I've never seen anything like it. Frank felt sweat slide down his back. Is it serious? I don't know, Ruth admitted, but she's healthy. That's what matters for now. That night Frank made his decision. He would not take the child to any adoption office. He would not call the state police. Something in him, something he could not name, told him this child had come into his life for a reason, and that his duty was to protect her, no matter where she came from. He named her Lyra because the constellation Lyra had been the brightest thing in the sky the moment before the light fell. Lyra Calloway, a simple human name for a child who clearly was not. Far from the farm, in a monitoring installation buried in the Wyoming mountains, a radar had registered the entry of an unidentified object into the atmosphere. That same night, Colonel Raymond Sterling, who ran a quiet office that tracked strange things falling out of the sky, studied the report. The signal had vanished as fast as it had appeared, leaving nothing for the tracking systems to follow. Probably a meteor, said his aide, Sergeant Diane Kovac, studying the screen. Sterling was not so sure. The trajectory matched no known meteor pattern, and the energy released at the moment of impact was thousands of times greater than anything a mere meteor could generate. He filed the report with a follow-up note and ordered the area checked again over the coming months without much priority. He had too many similar open cases to give one more his full attention. Nobody in Bent Creek, Nebraska, knew that a fragment of an entire empire, light years away, slept quietly in a blanket-lined wooden crate in the house of a lonely farmer who had only just begun to understand that his life would never be the same. Frank sat by the makeshift crib that night, watching the child sleep. Her little hands moved now and then, as if she dreamed of places he could never imagine. Outside, the wind moved gently across the cornfields, slowly erasing the traces of the crater, which nature would soon reclaim as her own. I don't know who you are, Frank whispered to the sleeping child, or where you came from, but I promise you're going to be all right, I promise. It was a simple promise, spoken quietly in a silent Nebraska house. But that promise, though Frank did not know it yet, would cross the limits of a single planet and 15 years later reach the ears of an entire empire that had been hunting for this child since the day her ship vanished among the stars. The first years were the hardest for Frank, learning to change diapers, to mix formula, to calm the crying of a child who sometimes woke in the night wailing in a language that was not any language known on Earth. Lyra grew quickly, too quickly for the parenting books Frank bought at the drugstore in Bent Creek. She was walking steadily at 8 months. At 2, she spoke in full sentences with a clarity that surprised everyone who heard her. She's a remarkably bright child, Edna Ferris, the teacher at the small Bent Creek school, told Frank again and again after Lyra started kindergarten at 5. I've never seen a child learn to read so fast. Frank would smile and thank her, but inside he felt a mix of pride and worry. He knew Lyra was not like the other children in town, and every day brought a fresh reminder. One afternoon when she was 6, Frank found her sitting in the garden, staring at a wilted flower. Before his eyes, the flower regained its color and straightened on its stem, as if time had rolled backward a few days. Lyra seemed to notice nothing strange about what she had done. She simply got up and went back to her play, as if making dead things bloom again were the most ordinary thing in the world. Frank never told her what he had seen. He could not explain it to himself. He filed the memory away with the others that accumulated, one by one. The time Lyra at 7 caught a glass plate falling from the table with a speed no human child could match. The time a high-fever night made her skin glow faintly beneath the sheets, as if she carried a small moon under her skin. The time she dreamed aloud of a city of pale stone towers standing by a silver sea, describing every detail with a precision no child could invent from imagination alone. Ruth Emery kept examining Lyra once a year, under the excuse of a routine checkup. Every exam turned up something new that did not match the biology her textbooks described. Lyra's blood had a slightly different composition, with cells that regenerated faster than expected. Her bones were denser and more flexible at the same time. Ruth never asked awkward questions in front of Frank. She simply wrote her observations in a private notebook kept in her own house, far from the county hospital. Nell's records. One day we're going to have to talk about this seriously, Ruth told Frank one afternoon after another checkup. They were sitting on the clinic porch, watching Lyra play with a stray mutt she had adopted without asking anyone, a scruffy brown dog she called Patch. I know, Frank said, but not yet. Let me give her a few more years of ordinary childhood before the world learns she isn't. Ruth nodded, though her eyes held a worry that did not go away easily. She loved Lyra as she would her own niece, and the worry came from affection, not suspicion. Boyd Tucker, for his part, became a sort of uncle to the girl. He taught her to repair engines, to change the oil in the pickup, to name every part of the old tractor they kept in the barn. Lyra soaked up every lesson with astonishing ease, and by the time she turned 10, she could fix things even Boyd could not fix. That girl's got the hands of a born mechanic, Boyd would say with pride, never knowing how much deeper a truth those words carried. Life in Bent Creek kept its quiet course. Summers were hot, winters cold, and between one and the other Lyra grew into a curious, kind young woman, deeply bound to her father. Though he was not her biological father, he had never hidden the truth from her entirely. When she was 9 and began to ask questions about her mother, Frank told her in simple words that he had found her in a field after a very bad storm, and that from that day he had decided to care for her as if she were his own daughter. "Why did you find me in a field?" Lyra asked, with the natural curiosity of a child. "I don't know, sweetheart," Frank said, stroking her dark hair, "but I thank God every day that I did." Lyra accepted that answer without pressing. She was happy. She had a father who loved her, a town that knew her, friends at school, and a dog that followed her everywhere. She did not need to know more than that, at least not yet. But as she moved toward adolescence, some things began to change in ways that could no longer be so easily ignored. At 12, Lyra began having recurring dreams about a woman with long silver-white hair who spoke to her in a language she did not understand, yet felt deeply familiar. Some nights she woke crying, unable to explain why she felt so sad after a dream she could barely remember. "It's just a phase," Frank told her, trying to soothe her, though inside he felt something approaching, something he had spent years fearing without giving it a name. In the Wyoming installation, Colonel Raymond Sterling kept reviewing reports of unidentified aerial phenomena as part of his routine work. For years, the case of the object that had fallen near Bent Creek had sat in the archive, ignored. But one day the sensors at a nearby monitoring station registered a strange anomaly, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse of energy coming from exactly the same area where the object had gone down years before. "That same frequency again, sir," Sergeant Diane Kovac said, showing him the data. "It's very weak, but it's identical to the reading from that night." Sterling frowned, studying the map with its mark over the Calloway cornfield. Any activity reported in that area, any unusual incidents. Kovac checked the local files. Nothing official, just a farmer named Frank Calloway. He's lived there over 15 years. No record, no strange reports. He has a teenage daughter. Sterling sat thinking for a moment. The coincidence was too precise to ignore, but there was not enough evidence to justify a full investigation. He decided to send a discreet team to the area, under the cover of a routine geological survey, to observe from a distance without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, in Bent Creek, life went on, and no one noticed that forces far larger than a small Nebraska town had already begun to move. Lyra turned 13 without any extraordinary incident, except that she began to feel different from her classmates. She was stronger, faster, sharper than normal, and although she tried hard to hide it, some moments slipped away from her. During a school basketball game, she caught a ball flying straight at a classmate's face with a speed that left everyone gaping. When they asked how she had done it, she laughed nervously and said she had gotten lucky. Nobody pressed further, but Frank, who was in the stands that afternoon, felt time running out. The quiet childhood he had wanted to give Lyra was beginning to show cracks, more visible every day. That night, after the game, Frank sat with her on the porch under a starry sky that seemed to watch them in silence. "Lyra, there's something I want you to know," he began, his voice unsteady. "From the day I found you, I always knew you were special. Not just special the way any father would say of his daughter. Special in a way I don't fully understand myself." Lyra watched him with those amber eyes that always seemed to see more than words could say. "Spessa. Lal how dads." Frank took a deep breath. "I found you inside something that fell out of the sky. I don't know exactly what it was. I don't know where you came from, but I know you're not from here, sweetheart, not entirely." Lyra was silent for a long time, taking in the words. Far from being frightened, something inside her seemed to click into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. "I always felt like something was missing," she whispered, looking at the stars. "I didn't know what it was, but now, somehow, it makes more sense." Frank held her close, feeling he had done the right thing in telling her the truth, even if it was only part of it. He did not know what would come next, or how much longer they had of the quiet life they had built together. But for that night, under the Nebraska stars, father and daughter felt closer than ever, not knowing that very soon those same stars would bring answers that would change everything forever. The summer Lyra turned 15 brought a heat unlike the summers before it. It was not just the Nebraska weather, which was fierce enough in that season anyway. It was something in the air, a tension Frank could not identify until it was too late to stop what had already begun. Lyra's nights turned hard. Her dreams were no longer vague images of a woman with silver-white hair. Now they were full scenes, with sound, with voices, with a language she was beginning to understand piece by piece, though she had never studied it. She saw a vast city of pale stone towers rising beside a silver sea. She saw ships crossing an amber sky without a sound, and an empty throne at the center of an immense hall, ringed by banners bearing a symbol she did not recognize but felt, somehow, to be deeply her own. "There's a war," she told Frank one night after waking trembling at 3 in the morning. "I don't know how I know, but there's a war, and somebody died protecting me." Frank sat on the edge of her bed, holding her hand firmly. "Who died, Lyra?" "I don't know," she said, tears falling for reasons she could not explain. "But I feel like I lost both of them, my mother and my father, my real parents." That night Frank could not sleep. He lay awake thinking of all the signs he had ignored for 15 years, trying to understand what it truly meant that his daughter was beginning to remember things from a world she had never seen with her own eyes, at least not in this life. The changes were not only in her dreams. Her physical strength, already remarkable since childhood, became almost impossible to hide. One afternoon, helping Boyd Tucker lift a heavy engine block in the garage, she raised it alone, effortlessly, while two customers waiting for their turn stared in disbelief. In the garage light, the warm copper cast of her skin, so easy to mistake for a Nebraska tan, gleamed like polished bronze. "Lyra, easy," Boyd whispered, his eyes wide, as she set the engine on the workbench as if it were a box of shoes. "I'm sorry," she murmured, embarrassed, realizing too late that she had forgotten to hold back in front of strangers. That same week, an unknown man appeared at the edge of the timber that ringed the Calloway farm. Frank saw him first from a distance, a tall figure in clothing that fit neither the weather nor anything from any catalog Frank had ever seen. When Frank approached with his shotgun, ready to ask what a stranger was doing so close to his property, the man was already gone into the trees, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air behind him, like the trace of something that did not entirely belong to this world. Frank said nothing to Lyra about the encounter, but he reinforced the fences around the property and began sleeping with the shotgun loaded beside his bedroom door. He knew, in his bones, that something was coming, something that had waited 15 years for the moment to appear. Meanwhile, in Wyoming, Colonel Sterling had finally gathered enough evidence to justify a deeper investigation. The team he had sent to Bent Creek under the Geological Survey cover had captured, without anyone noticing, a blurred photograph of Lyra lifting that engine with no effort at all. The photograph, taken from a distance with a special lens, landed on Sterling's desk with a detailed report on the energy anomalies recorded in the area over recent months. "This isn't a meteor, Colonel," Sergeant Diane Kovac said, pointing at the photograph. "This is a person doing something no person should be able to do." Sterling studied the image in silence for several seconds. "Assemble a team. I want to talk to that family directly without making a spectacle." The meeting came on a hot afternoon, when two official vehicles without any visible military markings pulled up in front of the Calloway house. Sterling stepped out of the first in civilian clothes, followed by Kovac and two more men who stayed near the vehicles, scanning the surroundings with an attention that was not lost on Frank. "Good afternoon," Sterling said, showing identification that claimed he belonged to an environmental research agency. "We're conducting a survey of soil conditions in this area. Would you mind answering a few questions, Mr. Calloway?" Frank knew something was wrong from the first second. The way the men studied the house, the way their eyes moved, looking for something more than soil samples, everything told him this visit had nothing to do with environmental research. "Sure, ask whatever you need," Frank said, keeping his calm, though inside his mind was already working out how to protect Lyra, who was in the barn at that moment helping with the afternoon chores. The conversation moved through seemingly harmless questions about the history of the property, changes in the terrain, strange events Frank might have noticed over the years. Frank answered each one calmly, revealing nothing, until Sterling asked the question he had really come to ask. "I understand you have a teenage daughter living here with you," Sterling said, in a casual tone that did not quite hide the intention behind the words. "We'd like to meet her, just out of curiosity, since we're discussing the property's history." At that exact moment, Lyra came out of the barn, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar vehicles in front of the house. Sterling watched her with an intensity that made Frank step forward instinctively, placing himself partly between them. "Lyra, go inside, sweetheart," Frank said, trying to sound calm. But Lyra, with the special sensitivity she had always possessed for reading people's intentions, felt something strange in those strangers' eyes. It was not simple curiosity. It was the look of someone who already knew something and was looking to confirm a suspicion. Sterling took a step closer, drawing from his pocket a small device that gave off a faint tone as it approached her, like a counter detecting something invisible in the air. Lyra stepped back instinctively, and at that moment, without being able to control it, a flash of golden light flared briefly around her hands, dying away almost as fast as it had appeared. The silence that followed was absolute. Kavak's hand moved toward her holster by reflex, but Sterling raised his hand quickly, stopping her. "Nobody moves," Sterling ordered, his voice firm but not raised. He looked at Lyra with a mixture of wonder and resolve that Frank could not fully read. "We didn't come here to hurt anyone, but I need you to understand, what just happened here can't go unexplained." Frank moved fully in front of Lyra, arms spread, ready for whatever was necessary. "She hasn't hurt anybody. She's just a child." "I know," Sterling said, surprising Frank with the sincerity in his tone. "And that's exactly why I came quietly and not with a whole battalion. I want to understand what's happening here, Mr. Calloway, and I believe you deserve answers too, after 15 years of carrying this alone." The tension held for several long minutes, until Frank, understanding that there was no longer any way to hide the truth completely, agreed to talk with Sterling inside the house, leaving Lyra under the attentive but respectful eye of Sergeant Kavak outside. It was that same night, as Sterling and his men withdrew with a promise to return in a few days with more questions, and in his words, more resources to protect the family if the situation required it, that the real danger finally made its appearance. Just after midnight, a deep sound, like thunder that refused to end, began to fill the air. Frank ran out onto the porch, followed close behind by Lyra, who felt the sound not only in her ears but in every bone of her body, as if her own blood recognized the vibration. In the sky, hiding the stars with its impossible size, a ship was descending slowly over the fields outside Bent Creek. It was unlike any aircraft Frank had ever seen, not in movies nor in military documentaries. It had a long shape with lights pulsing in a pattern that almost seemed to breathe, and it was so large that its shadow covered the farm completely, plunging everything into darkness that only the ship's own lights managed to break. Lyra stood frozen, staring upward, eyes full of tears she could not say were fear or recognition rising from the deepest part of her being. Something inside her, something that had slept for 15 years, was finally waking completely. "Dad," she whispered, without taking her eyes from the sky, "I think they came for me." Frank took her hand firmly, feeling that the world they had built together, that simple, quiet Nebraska world, was about to change forever. The ship stopped a few yards above the ground, hovering over the cornfield without crushing a single stalk, as if its weight were nothing against the will of whoever commanded it. A ramp opened along its side with a soft, almost silent sound, and a warm golden light spilled out over the dark soil of Nebraska. Frank felt his heart beating with a force that threatened to break out of his chest. He held the shotgun in one trembling hand, though deep down he knew that weapon would be useless against whatever was about to come down that ramp. In his other hand he held Lyra's, and she was no longer trembling with fear, but with a different emotion, something like anticipation, like a person about to remember something they had forgotten for a lifetime. The first figures to come down the ramp were guards, tall, dressed in armor of a material that reflected light in a strange, almost liquid way. They carried no visible weapons, but they moved with the discipline of soldiers trained from childhood to protect someone with their own lives. They formed up on either side of the ramp, leaving a clear path down the center. Then she appeared. She was a woman of commanding stature, with warm copper skin that seemed to hold a deep inner fire, the color of polished bronze of a desert at sundown, richer than any human tan. Her hair was long and silver white, flowing loose over her shoulders and down her back, moving softly in the night air like a banner. She wore a long robe of deep blue, threaded with gold in patterns that looked like the symbols of an ancient language. Her eyes, the same deep amber as Lyra's, settled on the girl with an intensity that made time itself seem to pause for an instant. Aelina, the woman said, in a voice that resonated not only through the air, but through something far deeper inside Lyra. At last we find you. Lyra felt her legs trembling at the sound of that name. It was not her name, not the name Frank had given her, but something inside her recognized the word as if it had been spoken 1,000 times before, in a life she was only beginning to remember in fragments of dreams. "Who are you?" Lyra asked, her voice breaking, though she did not step back even a single pace. The woman advanced slowly, stopping at a respectful distance, aware that she faced not only a confused young woman, but also a man standing behind her with a protectiveness she seemed to understand and to respect. "My name is Vera," the woman said. "I am the regent of the Dominion of Vaella and sister of the queen you were born to." She paused. "And you, young one, are Aelina Vardos, the legitimate daughter of King Torvin and Queen Myra, the true rulers of our people, before treason took their lives." The silence that followed those words was absolute. Even the wind did not dare to move through the corn. Frank felt the ground turn unsteady beneath his feet, as if the whole reality he had built over 15 years were shaking with every word the regent spoke. "That's impossible," Frank managed, stepping forward, careful not to appear as a threat. "She's my daughter. I found her in a field 15 years ago alone, in a ship that destroyed itself in front of my eyes." Vera looked at Frank with an expression that surprised both of them, a mixture of gratitude and deep sorrow. "And for that, human, you have my eternal debt. That ship you saw destroy itself was the Royal Cradle, a lifeboat designed to release its passenger and then erase every trace of itself, precisely so that nothing could lead the assassins to her." "Assassins," Frank repeated, feeling the blood go cold in his veins. Vera nodded slowly, the weight of 15 years of war showing in every line of her face. 15 years ago, a council of traitor nobles, led by a man named Heir Call, rose against the legitimate throne of Vaella. They murdered King Torvin in his own throne room. Queen Myra, gravely wounded, managed to escape with her newborn daughter to the royal cradle, the only one still operational, and she sent it away, to whatever world was distant enough to keep the child safe, knowing she herself would not survive the passage. Lyra felt tears running down her face without control, while fragments of her dreams, the woman with silver-white hair, the voices in an unknown language, finally found a real context. Painful, but real. "My mother, she died protecting me," Lyra whispered, more a statement than a question. "Yes," Vera confirmed, her voice breaking for the first time since she had come down the ramp. "She was my sister. From that day I have ruled as regent, searching every corner of the known galaxy for you, waiting for the moment when the cradle's signal, the only clue we had, would resurface strongly enough to fix your exact location. 15 years, Aelina. 15 years searching for the only legitimate heir who can finally end the civil war that has torn our dominion apart since your parents' deaths." The magnitude of those words fell on Lyra like an impossible wave. She was not just a girl found in a cornfield. She was the heir to a throne at war, the key to ending a conflict that had cost thousands of lives on a world she had never seen, but which she felt, somehow, deeply as her own. And it was at that moment that the sound of vehicles approaching at high speed broke the tension of the encounter. The headlights of several military trucks lit up the dirt road leading to the farm, and within minutes Colonel Raymond Sterling stepped out of his vehicle, followed by Sergeant Kovac and a far larger contingent of soldiers than the discreet visit of days before. Sterling stopped dead at the sight of the ship hovering over the field, and the alien guards standing in formation with a discipline that made clear any attempt at aggression would end very badly for whoever tried it. "Nobody moves," Sterling called out, though his voice sounded less certain than before, clearly overwhelmed by the scale of what he faced. "Identify yourselves. This is sovereign United States territory." Vera turned towards Sterling with a calm that contrasted sharply with the military tension he represented. "Colonel, we come with no hostile intent toward your world. We come only for the young woman your government has already identified as different. I ask you, with all respect, to stand your men down before this situation becomes unnecessarily complicated." Sterling looked at Lyra, then at Frank, and finally at the imposing figure of Vera and her guards. He was clearly weighing every possible outcome of the confrontation, calculating the risk of a conflict his country, perhaps the whole planet, was not prepared to face. "I will not allow a citizen of this country to be taken without clear explanations," Sterling answered, holding his position, though with a discreet gesture he ordered his men to lower their weapons for the moment, avoiding needless provocation. Frank, sensing that the situation could spiral out of control at any moment between two forces that clearly did not trust each other, stepped forward and placed himself at the center of that triangle of tension. "With respect to both of you," Frank said, in a voice that was surprisingly steady despite the fear he felt inside, "this decision doesn't belong to either of you. It belongs to her." All eyes turned to Lyra. The girl, face still wet with tears but with a determination growing with every passing second, stepped forward, moving slightly away from both Frank and Vera, claiming her own space to think clearly in the middle of that chaos. "I need time," Lyra said, addressing both the regent and the colonel. "All my life I've been Lyra Calloway, a Nebraska farmer's daughter. 5 minutes ago I learned I'm also the heir to a throne in an empire I've never seen, daughter of parents who died protecting me from a war I didn't even know existed. I am not going to make a decision of that magnitude in the middle of a cornfield, with soldiers pointing guns at me." Vera inclined her head slightly, a gesture which, in her culture, as she would explain later, represented respect before the will of royalty, even royalty as young and inexperienced as Lyra. "You are right, Aelina. You deserve time to understand the magnitude of your inheritance, but I must warn you that time is not a luxury our dominion can afford easily. Viharen still holds power, and so long as you live anywhere in the galaxy, he will keep sending hunters to eliminate you before you can claim your right to the throne." Those words struck Frank like a blow. "Hunters, here, on my farm." Vera nodded gravely. "The man you saw prowling the edge of your property a few days ago, Colonel Mr. Calloway, was not a curious stranger. He was an observer of Viharen's Iron Court, sent to confirm Aelina's location before a full elimination team arrived. My arrival, fortunately, beat them by a narrow margin, but I cannot guarantee there are not more on the way." The weight of that revelation changed the atmosphere of the conversation completely. It was no longer only about a personal decision concerning Lyra's identity. It was about the safety of a whole town, a farm, a family that had lived in peace for 15 years without knowing the danger had always been closer than they imagined. Sterling, his face tight with the new information, approached Vera with a less hostile posture than before. "If what you're saying is true, then we have a common problem, Your Grace. This girl's safety, and now I understand, this town's safety, depends on resolving this with brains, not with guns pointed at each other." Vera regarded the colonel with new appreciation, recognizing in his words a practical wisdom she valued deeply, no matter what world it came from. "I agree, Colonel. I propose we allow Aelina, or Lyra, as she prefers to be called for now, the time she needs to choose her path, while our forces cooperate to ensure that no hunter of Viharens ever gets close enough to harm her." Frank looked at Lyra, searching her eyes for some sign of what she was feeling in that overwhelming moment. She met his gaze, and in silence, without the need for words, they both understood that the quiet life they had built together in Bent Creek would be exactly the same, no matter what decision she finally made. "Thank you," Lyra said, addressing both Vera and Sterling, "for giving me room to think. but I need you both to understand something clearly. Whatever I decide about that throne, about that war, about that world I'm only beginning to know, Frank Calloway is my father. That is not negotiable by anyone." Vera smiled, a small but genuine smile, charged with an emotion that surprised even her own guards. That strength of character, Aelina, is exactly why your mother would have been proud of you. And I promise you here and now that no one will ever ask you to renounce the man who raised you with so much love. The night continued with a tense but necessary cooperation between the Imperial Guards and Colonel Sterling's forces, establishing a security perimeter around the Calloway farm, while Lyra sat beside Frank on the porch of the house, trying to process the avalanche of information she had received in the course of a few hours. She knew that somewhere in the galaxy, a man named Viharen Kall ruled an empire that rightfully belonged to her, and that very soon she would have to decide whether she was willing to fight to take it back. Just after 3 in the morning, when exhaustion had finally closed Lyra's eyes for a few minutes on the sofa in the living room, a strange sound jolted Frank awake. It was not the wind, nor any animal of the fields. It was an unnatural silence, as if the crickets and the frogs down by the creek had decided, all at once, to stop. Frank rose slowly, took the shotgun from beside the door, and looked out the kitchen window. The Imperial Guard's Vera had left watching the perimeter stood motionless, but not naturally. They were frozen like statues, a pale blue energy surrounding their bodies, unable to move or to make a sound. "Lyra," Frank whispered, heart hammering, moving toward the living room. "Lyra, wake up." She opened her eyes just as a dark figure stepped through the front door without opening it, as if the wood and the metal were no obstacle at all to its body. The figure wore armor of pure black, without shine or ornament, designed clearly for silent elimination rather than open combat. Its eyes, visible through a narrow slit in the helmet, burned a deep red, a stark contrast to the warm amber of Lyra's. "Aelina Vardos," the figure said, its voice distorted by some device within the helmet. "The Iron Court has ordered your elimination. There is no place in this universe far enough to hide from us." Frank raised the shotgun at once, putting himself between the hunter and Lyra, though his instinct told him that weapon posed no real threat to an enemy that could walk through walls. "You're not touching her," he said, his voice steady, without a single tremor despite the fear running through every part of him. The hunter raised one hand, and an invisible wave of energy flung Frank against the wall with a force that drove the air from his lungs. The shotgun clattered to the floor, out of reach. Lyra, seeing her father struck down and struggling to breathe, felt something inside her finally break, not from pain, from a fury and an instinct of protection that had waited 15 years for this exact moment to awaken completely. The golden light that before had only flared in small sparks around her hands now wrapped her whole body like a second skin of pure energy. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that lit the entire room, and when the hunter tried to launch another attack directly at her, Lyra stopped it with one hand, holding the wave of energy in the air as if it were something as simple as catching a ball. "You're not touching my father," Lyra said, in a voice that no longer sounded like a frightened teenager, but like someone who finally understood the real strength that ran in her blood. The hunter took a step back, visibly startled by how quickly the girl had mastered a power that, according to every report he had received, should have taken years to awaken fully without proper training. He tried a second, stronger attack, but Lyra was already moving with a speed no human eye could follow, dodging the strike and placing herself directly before him before he could react. With a firm but controlled movement, without the intention of causing irreversible harm, Lyra seized the hunter's arm and channeled her own energy into the device that powered the black armor, overloading it completely. The hunter fell to his knees, armor dead, unable to move, trapped by his own technology, now useless. At that exact moment, Vera and her guards burst into the house, alerted by the sudden interruption in the surveillance signal they maintained over the perimeter. They stopped in the doorway of the living room, finding Lyra standing over the defeated hunter, the golden light still wrapping her body, while Frank slowly rose from the floor, bruised but entirely safe. "Aelina," Vera said, with a mixture of wonder and pride she did not try to hide. "I have never seen anyone awaken their full power so quickly, with no formal training at all." Lyra lowered her gaze to her own hands, still glowing faintly, feeling a mix of fear and a strange sense of completeness, as if she had finally found a part of herself that had been unfinished her whole life. "I didn't do it for power," she said quietly. "I did it because they were hurting my father." Vera came closer, ordering her guards to take the captured hunter to the ship for interrogation later. She stopped before Lyra with a serious expression, touched with a tenderness she had not shown until that moment. "That is exactly the kind of strength our Dominion needs, Aelina. Strength born of love, not ambition. Your mother ruled in that same way, and that is why the people loved her deeply, far more than they ever loved V. Heron." Colonel Sterling arrived a few minutes later, alerted by his own surveillance teams to the unusual activity at the farm. Seeing the captured hunter and hearing the brief summary of what had happened, he understood with complete clarity that the threat against Lyra, and potentially against Earth itself if the conflict escalated, was far more real than he had first imagined. "This changes things," Sterling said, studying the dead black armor on the floor. "If V. Heron is willing to send killers all the way to this planet, we can't guarantee this girl's complete safety, or this town's, while she stays here as a visible target." Lyra heard those words with care, feeling the weight of the decision before her grow more urgent by the minute. She looked at Frank, who had sat down in a nearby chair, still catching his breath after the blow, but with an expression of absolute pride on his face despite the pain. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked, kneeling before him. "I'm more than all right," Frank said, taking her face gently between his hands. "I'm alive because of you, and I'm proud of the woman you're becoming, even though I'm only beginning to understand what all of it means." That night marked a definitive change in the way Lyra saw her own identity. She no longer felt torn between Lyra Calloway, a Nebraska farmer's daughter, and Aelina Vardos, the heir to a throne at war. She was beginning to understand, little by little, that the two identities did not have to conflict. She could be both at the same time, and perhaps that unique combination was exactly what her Dominion needed after years of leadership based only on fear and ambition. Over the following days, with the Calloway farm turned into a discreet meeting point between Colonel Sterling's forces and Vera's Imperial Guards, Lyra spent hours talking with the regent about the history of Vaella, the customs of her people, the reasons that had led V. Heron to betray the royal family. She learned that her mother had been a ruler loved by her people precisely because she put the welfare of ordinary folk above the interests of the nobility, a philosophy that had created powerful enemies among the nobles who profited from the old order. V. Heron always believed that force and fear were the only ways to keep order, Vera explained, sitting with Lyra on the porch as the sunset painted the Nebraska sky in shades of orange and violet. In the falling light, the warm copper of her skin seemed to catch fire, and her long silver-white hair moved like a stream of light in the wind. "Your mother believed in something different. She believed a strong ruler was one who could show compassion without losing authority. Many in the Dominion still remember that ideal, and they wait for the day someone restores it." Lyra asked her then why her mother had sent her to Earth of all the worlds in the galaxy. Vera told her the Queen's reasoning, and it was a strange and beautiful thing. The people of Vaella carry a resonance, a living fire in the blood that the gifted can sense across vast distances. The hunters of the Iron Court and the seers who serve them track that fire the way hounds track a scent. But Earth is the quiet world, a world without the gift, where that fire had never burned. The queen had known that a child raised among humans would be invisible to the seers until her power ripened, masked by the very silence of the human race. What made humanity unremarkable to the galaxy was precisely what made their world the perfect hiding place for a stolen dynasty. It was the slyest act of a dying queen, and the bravest, Vera said. She gambled her daughter's life on the idea that ordinary people, kind, stubborn, unremarkable people, could keep safe what all the fleets of Vaella could not. And she had been right, Lyra thought. The ordinary people of Bent Creek had done what an entire empire could not. She thought of Frank, 15 years of being raised without fear or force, only patience, example, and an unconditional love that never asked for anything in return. She understood at that moment, perhaps the best preparation she could have had for ruling an entire empire, had not come from any formal royal training, but from the simple lessons of a lonely farmer in a small American town. "I want to go back," Lyra said at last, after days of deep reflection. "I want to reclaim my mother's throne, not for power, but because I believe I can end the suffering Heron has caused. But I can't do it alone, and I can't do it by abandoning this life, which is also real to me." Vera nodded as if she had been waiting for exactly that answer. "There is a way, Aelina. As the legitimate heir, you have the authority to establish formal alliances between Vaella and any world you choose to call an ally. You could keep this planet under the direct protection of the imperial throne and visit freely whenever you wish, while we work together to restore order to our dominion." The proposal came with a condition that Lyra did not hesitate to state at once. "He comes with me, not as a prisoner, not as a temporary guest, as my father, with all the respect and protection that title deserves within your court." Vera smiled, that same small, sincere smile she had shown before. No noble in Vaella would dare question the regent's word on that matter, Aelina. And honestly, having met the man, it would be an honor for our people to have someone of his character near the throne. Colonel Sterling, learning of the plan, offered his own cooperation, understanding that a formal alliance with a star empire represented a unique opportunity for Earth, provided it was handled with the discretion and respect needed to avoid global panic or unnecessary conflict. A simple but firm agreement was established among the three of them. Lyra would return to Vaella to claim her rightful throne, with Frank at her side, while Sterling quietly coordinated with his government the gradual opening of official communication between the two worlds, laying the foundations of a relationship that in time could benefit humanity enormously. The farewell in Bent Creek was not easy. Boyd Tucker, learning the full truth after years of suspecting that something extraordinary surrounded the girl who had learned to repair engines with uncanny ease, embraced Lyra with tears in his eyes, promising to keep the garage running for the day she decided to come back for a visit. Edna Ferris, the teacher who had watched her grow from kindergarten, handed her a sealed letter and asked her to read it only when she felt lost on her new road, as a reminder that she would always have a place to return to. Dr. Ruth Emery, who had kept so many medical secrets over the years, simply held her tight and whispered that she was proud of the young woman Lyra had become, no matter how many stars now separated her from Nebraska. Even Patch, the scruffy brown mutt, sat at the end of the lane that morning and watched them go, as if he understood. On the day of departure, the whole community of Bent Creek, not knowing the full truth but sensing that something important was happening, gathered near the Calloway farm to say goodbye, under the carefully built cover story of a long work trip that Frank and his daughter had decided to take together. Only a small circle, Vera, Sterling, Kovac, Boyd, and Ruth, knew the whole truth of where they were really going. Lyra stopped in front of the house where she had grown up, looking at every detail with deep nostalgia. The porch where Frank had told her the truth about her origins. The barn where she had learned to repair engines beside Boyd. the Cornfield where 15 years before she had fallen from the sky inside a ship that had turned to dust, leaving only a promise whispered in the darkness of a stormy night. "Ready?" Frank asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. Lyra looked at him, her amber eyes shining in the light of the setting sun, and smiled with a confidence she had never known before. "I'm ready, Dad, but I want you to know something before we go." "What's that, sweetheart?" "No matter what I find up there, no matter how many titles I have to carry or how many responsibilities I have to take on, I will always be Lyra Calloway first. The girl you found in a cornfield during a storm and chose to love without conditions, without even knowing what she was." Frank felt the tears finally escape his eyes after days of holding back the overwhelming emotion of everything he had lived. He held his daughter tight, feeling that the promise whispered 15 years before in a silent Nebraska house had now fully come true. "That's all I need to know," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. Together they climbed the ramp of the Imperial ship, leaving behind the farm, the town, and the quiet life they had built over 15 years. But they did not leave behind the love that bound them, nor the strength of character Lyra had inherited, both from her birth parents and from the man who had raised her with all his soul. Months L. Ader on Vaella, the empty throne that had waited 15 years, finally found its legitimate heir. The coronation was the great event of an age, the ancient rite of the undying flame, the living fire that answers only to the true blood of the royal line, had accepted her without hesitation, burning gold in her hands as she knelt before it. And when the High Court saw the flame rise for Aelina, the support that had held Heir in power for 15 years crumbled as if it had never been real. His own captains turned. The Iron Court dissolved. And the usurper who had murdered a king and a queen in the night was delivered, at last, to the Hall of Justice, to face the judgment his victims had been denied. The crowning of Empress Aelina, called fondly by her people the Empress of Two Worlds, marked the beginning of the end of the Long War. Her first acts were small and human, and they astonished the old nobility. She released the political prisoners of the Iron Court. She reopened the grain roads that Heron's greed had closed. She signed, with the blessing of her own court, the first formal treaty between Vaella and the quiet world of her upbringing, Earth, granting it protection and friendship in equal measure. And she refused, gently but firmly, to sit on the throne alone. Her regent stood at her right hand, and the man from Nebraska sat in the place of honor reserved for family. Vera herself, her warm copper skin luminous in the light of the coronation hall, her long silver-white hair falling loose beneath the coronet of her station, her amber eyes bright with a joy 15 years in the waiting, watched the crown settle on her niece's head, and for the first time since her sister's death, she wept in public without shame. Frank Calloway, seated in a place of honor during the ceremony, dressed in Vaellan robes that still felt strange to him, watched his daughter receive the crown with the same look of pride with which he had watched her take her first steps. 15 years before, on a small farm in Nebraska, a farmer who one stormy night had decided to raise an orphaned alien child, knowing nothing at all about what that single act of selfless love would mean for two worlds entirely different from each other, now sat beside the throne of a galactic empire, the proud father of an empress who governed not with fear, but with the same compassion and firmness he had taught her all her life. And on quiet nights, when Aelina, or simply Lyra, to those who truly knew her, sat beside her father on a balcony overlooking a silver sea under an amber sky, they always found a moment to remember the farm in Nebraska, the cornfield, and the simple promise that had changed forever the fate of two worlds no one had ever imagined could be so deeply connected.